They think the empath is weak because they stay quiet. They think kindness means softness. They think forgiveness means permission. But what nobody tells you is that the most dangerous moment is not when the empath cries, it's when the empath feels nothing anymore. Because once an empath stops caring, something terrifying happens. The calls stop getting answered. The explanations disappear. The emotional energy they once poured into everyone around them vanishes like smoke. And suddenly the people who took them for granted realize they were standing next to a soul that was carrying everyone the entire time. An empath will warn you 1,000 times without using words. Their silence becomes heavier. Their smile becomes shorter. Their eyes stop searching for understanding. But most people never notice the breaking point until it's too late.
See, empaths don't leave quickly.
That's what makes this different. They stay through disrespect. They stay through betrayal. They stay through emotional exhaustion that would destroy most people. They keep giving chance after chance because they believe people can change. But every time they forgive what shattered them, a small piece of the higher emotional connection dies, and one day there's nothing left. That's the moment people confuse peace with coldness. But it's not coldness. It's emotional survival. Because an empath who finally stops caring has usually suffered in silence for years. They learned how to cry without making noise. How to sit in rooms full of people while feeling completely alone. How to overthink every conversation wondering if they were too much or not enough. And eventually, their heart gets tired of begging for the bare minimum. The terrifying part is this. When an empath is done, they don't become emotional. They become emotionally unreachable. No revenge, no screaming, no dramatic exit, just distance. And distance from an empath feels different. Because when they loved you deeply. They remembered the small details. They protected your feelings while ignoring their own pain. They saw the broken parts of you and still chose compassion. So when that energy disappears, people feel the absence immediately. Suddenly nobody listens the same way anymore. Nobody supports them the same way anymore. Nobody makes them feel emotionally safe anymore. That's when regret begins. But by then, the empath has already disconnected emotionally. And once that happens, reconnecting becomes nearly impossible, because empaths don't stop caring overnight. They stop caring after surviving disappointment for too long. Every ignored feeling, every manipulative apology, every moment they stayed awake trying to fix relationships alone, it builds pressure inside them until one day their mind says something their heart never wanted to hear. Stop pouring love into places that only drain you. That sentence changes everything. Because now the empath who once chased closure chooses silence. The empath who once begged to be understood stops explaining themselves. The empath who once tolerated emotional chaos starts protecting their peace like their life depends on it. And honestly, it does. People are shocked when empaths become detached because they never expected boundaries from someone so understanding. They thought the empath would always stay, always forgive, always absorb the damage. But even the softest hearts have limits. A drowning person cannot keep saving everyone else. The scary truth is that when an empath finally walks away emotionally, they go away. D10 glow differently afterward, calmer, sharper, more focused, because they stop wasting energy trying to heal people who enjoyed hurting them. That transformation scares people, not because the empath became cruel, but because they became unavailable to manipulation. And manipulators panic when they lose emotional access. Suddenly guilt stops working. Fake apologies stop working. Silent treatments stop working. The empath sees through everything now. Pain sharpened their intuition. Suffering taught them patterns. And betrayal taught them self-respect. That's why an empath who stops caring becomes almost impossible to control. They no longer fear losing people. They fear losing themselves. Read that again in your mind. Most people never realize how powerful an empath truly is because empaths hide their strength behind compassion. But surviving emotional pain while remaining kind is one of the rarest forms of strength on earth. And eventually, that strength evolves. The empath learns that protecting their peace is not selfish. Saying no is not cruel. Walking away is not weakness. It is self-respect finally waking up. You can only touch fire so many times before your nervous system remembers the pain forever. And once an empath reaches that stage, something inside them changes permanently. People think an empath leaves because they stopped loving. That is the biggest misunderstanding of all. An empath almost never leaves when the pain begins. They leave when the pain becomes their entire reality. Because empaths are the type of people who keep giving love even while secretly falling apart inside. They will sit beside someone who is breaking them emotionally and still ask, "Are you okay?" That is how deep their compassion goes. Most people walk away after the first betrayal. Empaths stay after the 10th. Not because they are weak, but because their heart is wired to see potential instead of patterns. They believe every cold person is secretly wounded. Every manipulator is secretly hurting. Every toxic behavior can be healed with enough patience and understanding. And that belief destroys them slowly, because while everyone else is protecting themselves, the empath is busy protecting everyone else's feelings. They absorb pain like a sponge absorbs water. The anger in your voice, the disappointment in your silence, the energy behind your fake smile, they feel all of it, even the things you never say out loud. That is why emotional pain hits an empath differently. They do not simply hear words. They feel intentions. And when someone they love changes emotionally, the empath notices immediately. The shorter replies, the colder tone, the delayed affection, the emotional distance hiding behind "I'm just tired." They notice every shift. But instead of confronting it immediately, they blame themselves first. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I expect too much. So they stay quiet. They stay understanding. They stay patient, while their heart slowly breaks in silence. That is the tragedy of an empath. They can read everyone else perfectly, but struggle to defend themselves, because they always search for reasons to forgive people who hurt them. And people become addicted to that forgiveness. They learn the empath will stay. They learn apologies do not even need to be genuine anymore. They learn the empath will tolerate emotional inconsistency as long as there is a tiny amount of hope left. So the cycle continues. The empath gives. The other person takes. The empath explains. The other person. Urson dismisses. The empath cries alone at night, then wakes up the next morning pretending everything is normal. Nobody notices how exhausted they are becoming because empaths hide pain beautifully. They mastered the art of suffering quietly. They can be emotionally destroyed and still show up for everyone else. Still answer calls. Still motivate people. Still smile in public while fighting emotional wars in private. That level of emotional endurance is dangerous. Because when a person becomes used to carrying pain silently, nobody realizes how close they are to breaking. An empath does not explode dramatically when they are hurt. They disappear emotionally inch by inch. First, they stop explaining their feelings. Then they stop expecting effort. Then they stop believing they matter to the people they once gave everything to. And the saddest part is, most people only notice the empath's silence after they can no longer access their warmth. See, an empath's love is not loud. It is consistent. It is checking on you when nobody else does. Remembering the little details you forgot you even mentioned. Sensing your pain before you admit it yourself. Staying beside you during the versions of yourself that nobody else could tolerate. But because empaths give love so naturally, people start treating it like something ordinary until it disappears. Then suddenly everyone realizes how rare it was. An empath keeps trying because they genuinely believe relationships can heal through honesty and effort. But what destroys them is realizing they are often the only one trying. Imagine carrying every conversation emotionally. Imagine being the one who always apologizes first just to keep peace. Imagine overthinking every sentence because you fear hurting people who never cared about hurting you. That is the emotional reality of most empaths. They live inside emotional contradictions, strong enough to survive enormous pain, soft enough to still care about the people causing it. And because they love deeply, they also grieve deeply. Even when someone treats them badly, the empath still remembers the good moments, still remembers the potential, still remembers the version of that person they fell in love with emotionally. That memory keeps them trapped longer than they should stay. Because empaths do not just get attached to people. They get attached to Chanel, meaning that is why leaving hurts them more than anyone realizes. When an empath finally walks away emotionally, it is not impulsive. It comes after hundreds of nights fighting with themselves internally. Should I stay? Should I leave? Am I giving up too early? What if they change? What if I regret leaving? Their heart and mind become a battlefield. And while this war is happening inside them, the outside world sees nothing. They still function, still respond, still pretend. But internally, they are exhausted from carrying relationships alone. Eventually, something inside the empath begins to die. Not their kindness, not their ability to love, their hope. That is the first real sign the empath is reaching the end emotionally. Because an empath can survive pain. What they cannot survive forever is emotional emptiness. The feeling of loving harder and harder while receiving less and less in return. That kind of imbalance destroys the soul slowly. And one day the empath wakes up emotionally numb. Not angry, not dramatic, just tired. Tired of begging for consistency. Tired of feeling emotionally unseen. Tired of pouring oceans into people who only gave them drop. That numbness terrifies people later because it feels sudden. But it was never sudden. It was built through years of emotional neglect. Every broken promise added weight. Every cold response added distance. Every moment they cried silently beside someone who claimed to love them added another crack inside their heart. Until eventually the empath realizes something painful. I cannot heal in the same place that keeps hurting me. That realization changes everything. Because now the empath stops chasing, stops explaining, stops trying to force emotional connection where there is no emotional safety. And when an empath reaches that point, there is usually no return. People think the empath became cold, but they do not understand how many chances were given before the silence arrived. Empaths do not stop caring quickly. They stop caring after caring too much for too long, after carrying relationships on exhausted shoulders. After forgiving things they should have never forgiven. After abandoning themselves just to avoid losing other people. Eventually survival instincts take over. And the empath who once tolerated everything suddenly becomes unreachable emotionally. Because they lost their heart. Because they finally realized nobody was protecting it except them. The most dangerous version of an empath is not the one crying in silence. It is the one who no longer reacts. Because when an empath emotionally detaches, something terrifying happens. The person who once over-explained everything suddenly says nothing. The person who once chased connection suddenly becomes comfortable alone. The person who once forgave endlessly suddenly watches people walk away without stopping them. And that shift shocks everyone. Because people are used to the empath being emotionally available all the time. Used to their softness. Used to their patience. Used to the way they always tried to understand everyone else, even when nobody tried to understand them. So when that energy disappears, the silence becomes unsettling. An emotionally detached empath does not scream. They do not beg. They do not seek revenge. They simply disconnect. And disconnection from an empath feels like losing warmth you never appreciated until winter arrived. What makes this transformation powerful is that it usually happens after years of emotional suffering. The empath reach a point where their nervous system becomes exhausted from constantly surviving disappointment. Too many broken promises, too many fake apologies, too many moments where they gave their heart to people who only valued access to their kindness. Eventually, their soul realizes something their heart refused to accept. Not everyone deserves emotional access to me. That realization changes the empath forever, because now they stop responding emotionally to manipulation. And manipulators panic when empathy stops reacting. The guilt trips stop working. The silent treatments stop working. The emotional games lose power completely. Why? Because the empath finally sees the pattern instead of the potential. That is the difference. Before, the empath focused on who people could become. Now they focus on who people consistently choose to be. That awareness is dangerous. Because once an empath learns the difference between love and emotional control, they become almost impossible to manipulate again. They start noticing things they ignored before, how some people only contact them when they need emotional support, how some apologies only appear after consequences arrive, how some relationships survive only because the empath keeps sacrificing their peace to maintain them. And suddenly the empath becomes emotionally unavailable to toxicity. That is when people accuse them of changing. You became cold. You don't care anymore. You're distant now. But what nobody asks is how much pain created that distance in the first place. See, an empath never wanted to become detached. They wanted to be loved correctly. But after enough emotional betrayal, detachment becomes survival. Imagine giving your entire heart to people who only appreciated you when you were useful. Imagine always being the emotional support system while secretly having nobody to lean on yourself. Imagine staying loyal to people who kept testing how much disrespect you could tolerate before finally breaking. That kind of emotional exhaustion changes a person permanently, especially an empath, because empaths feel everything deeply, not just love, pain too. Every betrayal echoes longer in their mind. Every harsh word stays alive inside them longer than it should. Every emotional wound becomes another lesson teaching them who they cannot trust. And eventually those lessons become ARMO. WND. Empath who once trusted easily becomes careful. The empath who once gave endless chances becomes selective. The empath who once feared losing people begins fearing losing themselves more. That is real transformation. And it scares people because the empath no longer responds emotionally the same way. Before, they would chase closure. Now they choose silence. Before, they would overthink every conflict trying to fix things. Now they observe actions quietly and move differently. Before, they stayed attached to people who hurt them. Now they detach the moment they sense consistent disrespect. People call this coldness because they benefited from the empath having no boundaries. But boundaries feel offensive to people who were comfortable crossing lines. An empath who emotionally detaches becomes powerful because they stop needing validation from the people who damage them. Read that carefully. That is the moment emotional freedom begins. Because manipulation only works when someone still has emotional control over your self-worth. Once the empath reclaims that self-worth internally, external control disappears. Suddenly they no longer panic when someone pulls a why? They no longer beg to be chosen. They no longer destroy themselves trying to keep relationships alive alone. And the people around them notice immediately. The empath becomes calmer, harder to provoke, harder to guilt, harder to emotionally drain. Not because they stopped caring about people completely, but because they finally started caring about themselves too. That balance changes everything. See, many empaths were raised to believe love means sacrifice. So they tolerated emotional abuse while calling it patience. They tolerated neglect while calling it understanding. They tolerated manipulation while convincing themselves they were simply too sensitive. But emotional awakening destroys those illusions. The empath begins seeing how often they abandon their own needs just to keep other people comfortable. And once they see it, they cannot unsee it. That awareness creates emotional distance naturally, because now they recognize unhealthy patterns immediately. They recognize conversations that drain their spirit, relationships that only survive through guilt, people who only value them when they are giving endlessly. And instead of fighting to stay connected, empath quietly lets go. That is why detached empaths become untouchable emotionally. Not because they built walls around their heart forever, but because they learned access to their energy must be earned. You cannot repeatedly wound an empath and still expect unlimited emotional availability. Eventually their soul reaches its limit, and once that limit is crossed, something inside them closes permanently. Not their kindness, their tolerance for emotional disrespect. That version of the empath becomes incredibly dangerous to toxic people because they stop reacting emotionally to chaos. Drama no longer hooks them. Manipulation no longer confuses them. Fake affection no longer blinds them. The empath sees through everything now, because pain sharpened their intuition to another level. People forget empaths are naturally observant. They notice tone changes, energy shifts, micro-expressions, emotional inconsistencies. They always notice these things. The difference now is they stop ignoring what their intuition tells them. And intuition mixed with emotional detachment becomes powerful. because now the empath trusts their instincts more than empty words. That is why people who once controlled the empath emotionally suddenly feel powerless around them. The empath no longer seeks approval, no longer fears abandonment the same way, no longer sacrifices their identity to keep people close. They become emotionally independent. And emotional independence terrifies people who depended on the empath's emotional weakness, especially those who mistook kindness for weakness, because now the empath understands something life-changing. Love should feel safe, not exhausting. That sentence alone can transform an entire life. Once the empath realizes they deserve peace too, they stop accepting emotional chaos as normal. They stop shrinking themselves to fit into toxic relationships. Stop apologizing for feeling deeply. Stop explaining their boundaries to people committed to misunderstanding them. And suddenly their energy changes completely. Quieter, sharper, more protected. People think the empath lost their softness. They simply stopped offering softness to people who treated their heart carelessly. That is not cruelty. That is wisdom born from survival. Because eventually every empath learns the same painful truth. The people who benefit most from your lack of boundaries will always be the first ones upset when you finally create them. The empath's greatest transformation does not happen when they fall in love. It happens when they finally realize they have been abandoning themselves to keep other people comfortable. That realization changes everything. Because for most of their life, the empath believed love meant sacrifice. Sacrifice your peace. Sacrifice your sleep. Sacrifice your emotional stability. Sacrifice your needs so nobody else feels disappointed. And the terrifying part is, they became so good at this that people started expecting it from them. People became comfortable watching the empath carry emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. The empath became the listener, the fixer, the healer, the emotional safe place for everyone else. But nobody noticed how exhausted they were becoming internally. Nobody noticed the nights they sat alone replaying conversations in their mind, wondering if they were too emotional, too caring, too sensitive. That is the curse of an empath. They can deeply understand everyone else's pain while completely neglecting their own. And eventually, that self-end. Neglect becomes emotional self-destruction. Because no human being can survive forever while constantly pouring love outward and receiving emptiness in return. At some point, the soul begins screaming for protection, and that is where the empath's evolution begins. Not in anger, not in revenge, in awareness. The empath slowly starts realizing something painful. I keep saving people who never even ask if I'm drowning. That sentence hits differently when an empath finally feels it emotionally. Because empaths do not just give energy, they give pieces of themselves. Every conversation drains them. Every emotional burden stays in their nervous system. Every fake smile they force while suffering privately leaves another scar inside them. Yet they still kept showing up for people. That is what makes their transformation so powerful. When someone that's selfless finally chooses themselves, it shakes everyone around them. Because nobody expected boundaries from the person who always understood everything. See, people become addicted to the empath's tolerance. They become comfortable receiving endless patience, endless forgiveness, endless emotional access. But the moment the empath begins protecting their peace, suddenly people accuse them of changing. You're selfish now. You used to care more. You're not the same person. And they are right. The empath is no longer the same person. Pain transformed them. The old empath believed love meant enduring suffering silently. The new empath understands love should never require self-betrayal. That lesson costs empaths years of emotional damage to learn. Because empaths naturally search for goodness in people. Even after betrayal, even after disrespect, even after emotional manipulation. They keep hoping. And hope is beautiful until it chains you to situations destroying your spirit. Eventually, the empath reaches emotional exhaustion, a level of exhaustion so deep that even conversations feel heavy. Even fake smiles feel painful. Even answering messages feels emotionally draining. Because their nervous system has spent years surviving emotional chaos. That is why protecting peace becomes life-changing for an empath. It is not just a preference. It becomes survival. Suddenly, the empath no longer wants loud environments, no longer wants fake connections, no longer wants emotionally inconceased. 1T people constantly disrupting their inner world. They start craving calmness, real calmness. The kind that comes from no longer begging for love, no longer chasing validation, no longer explaining their worth to emotionally unavailable people. And once the empath experiences that peace for the first time, they never want to lose it again. That is when their standards rise dramatically. Not because they think they are better than others, but because they finally understand what emotional damage costs. Every betrayal changed them. Every disappointment matured them. Every sleepless night taught them something about human nature. So now they move differently. They stop forcing connections. Stop trying to rescue people who enjoy destroying themselves. Stop draining their soul just to prove they are worthy of being loved. That shift is powerful because it changes the energy of the empath completely. Before, they tolerated chaos just to avoid losing people. Now they would rather lose people than lose their inner peace. Read that again carefully. That is one of the strongest emotional transformations a human being can experience. Because the empath finally understands something. Most people never learn. Not everyone deserves access to your heart. And once they realize this, they become selective with their energy. Very selective. They start paying attention to how people make them feel after conversations. Drained or peaceful. Anxious or safe. Valued or emotionally used. The empath who once ignored red flags now notices everything immediately. Because protecting peace sharpens intuition. The empath stops romanticizing potential. Stops believing love alone can heal toxic behavior. Stops confusing emotional intensity with emotional safety. And suddenly relationships become clearer than ever before. They realize some people only loved their usefulness. Some only loved their forgiveness. Some only loved how much emotional labor the empath was willing to provide endlessly. That realization hurts deeply, but it also frees them. Because now the empath no longer fears being alone. They fear returning to environments that destroyed their mental and emotional health. That fear creates boundaries, strong boundaries. And boundaries are where the empath's real power begins. Now they say no without guilt. Now they walk away from disrespect faster. Now they stop over-explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. People call this coldness because they benefited from the empath having no self-protection before. But protecting your peace is not cruelty. It is maturity. The empath finally understands they cannot heal others while continuously bleeding emotionally themselves. That understanding changes their entire life. They become quieter. Not because they lost depth, but because they stopped wasting energy where it is not valued. They become harder to manipulate. Not because they stopped caring, but because they started recognizing emotional games faster. They become calmer, because they no longer chase people who create confusion in their spirit, and that calm energy becomes intimidating, especially to toxic people. Because toxic people survive through emotional access, chaos, control, confusion. But the evolved empath no longer feeds any of those things. They simply detach peacefully. That is what shocks people most. The empath who once begged to fix everything suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable to dysfunction. No drama, no revenge, no screaming, just self-respect and self-responsibility. Weak ET is terrifying to people who only felt powerful when the empath lacked it. The empath finally realizes they deserve relationships that feel emotionally safe, conversations that do not drain their soul, love that does not require constant suffering to maintain. That realization changes how they walk, think, speak, and love forever, because now they understand peace is priceless. And once an empath discovers inner peace after years of emotional chaos, they will protect it with every part of their soul. Even if it means walking away from people they once would have destroyed themselves trying to keep,